One chilly Friday night, a few friends and I decided to hit up the local bowling alley. It was a classic hangout spot, with neon lights and retro decor that hadn't changed since the 80s. The place was pretty quiet for a Friday, mostly occupied by a few scattered families and a couple of groups like ours. We were having a great time, laughing and making friendly competition out of our games. As the evening wore on, the alley began to empty, and soon, it was just our group and a couple of other patrons. The atmosphere became eerily calm, with the usual background hum of the bowling machines and occasional pins clattering. Around 11 p.m., we noticed something strange. The bowling lanes were getting unnaturally quiet, and the machines seemed to be malfunctioning. The screens flickered and then went dark, but the strange part was that the lane next to ours, which had been vacant all night, suddenly lit up as if someone had activated it. My friend Jenna, who had been eagerly waiting for her turn, suggested we check out the malfunctioning lane. It was probably just a glitch, she said, and a good laugh at that. We made our way over to the lane, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling settling in my stomach. When we reached the lane, it seemed to be functioning normally. No eerie noises, no malfunctioning screens. Just a typical lane, albeit with a strange sense of abandonment. We joked about the ghosts of bowlers past, trying to lighten the mood, but the atmosphere was definitely off. Then, we heard a soft, eerie sound coming from the back of the bowling alley. It was a low, moaning noise that seemed to be coming from the storage area. I was about to dismiss it as the sound of old machinery when the lights overhead flickered and went out completely. We were plunged into near total darkness. My heart raced. We pulled out our phones to use their flashlights, but the darkness seemed to amplify our anxiety. The only sound was the low, persistent moaning and an occasional clatter, like something where someone was moving around. We huddled together, trying to stay calm. I kept telling myself it was just a power issue, maybe coupled with some weird acoustics. Jenna, trying to be brave, suggested we check out the noise. I wasn't keen on the idea, but we all agreed that staying put might be more unsettling. We moved cautiously towards the storage area, our phone lights casting long shadows that danced unsettlingly on the walls. As we approached, the moaning grew louder, almost like whispers, and the clattering became more pronounced. We reached the door to the storage room and, with a collective breath, pushed it open. The room was a mess of old bowling equipment and dusty boxes. The moaning stopped abruptly. Everything seemed still. In the corner of the room, we saw a small, old radio sitting on top of a shelf. It was turned on, playing a static-filled broadcast that seemed to be the source of the moaning sound. As we approached, the radio suddenly went silent, and the lights flickered back on, as if nothing had happened. We stared at each other, trying to make sense of the situation. Our theories ranged from practical jokes to malfunctioning equipment. Despite the strange and creepy experience, we were all unharmed and safe. We decided to leave the alley, not quite sure what we had just encountered. Later, I learned that the bowling alley had been around for decades and had a history of unexplained occurrences, though none as bizarre as our experience. Theories about haunted equipment and old maintenance issues swirled around, but no one could explain the eerie moaning and sudden darkness we had experienced that night. It was a spine-chilling adventure that left us all with more questions than answers. To this day, every time I hear a flickering light or a mysterious noise, I can't help but think back to that eerie night at the bowling alley, wondering what really happened behind those retro lanes. I still remember that night at the bowling alley like it was yesterday. It was just a few years ago, during an unusually cold October. My friends and I, eager for a break from the daily grind, decided to hit up the local bowling alley. The place was old and had that classic, nostalgic feel: neon lights, worn-out carpets, and a faint smell of old shoes. We arrived around 10 p.m. and the place was surprisingly empty for a Saturday night. Aside from us, there was only one other group of bowlers in the back and a couple of staff members at the counter. We rented our shoes, grabbed a couple of lanes, and set up for a night of friendly competition. The night started off normally. We joked around, took turns rolling strikes and spares, and enjoyed ourselves. As the clock ticked past midnight, the bowling alley began to empty. The other group left, and the staff seemed eager to go home. The alley was down to just us and the occasional distant sound of a pin dropping or a ball rolling. That's when things took a strange turn. We were in the middle of a game when I noticed something odd about the lane next to us. It was completely vacant, but the ball return system had suddenly started up by itself. Balls began emerging from the return, rolling down the lane, but no one was there to use them. The sudden movement and noise were disorienting, and we all exchanged uneasy glances, Probably just a glitch, my friend Dave said, trying to brush it off. We decided to investigate, but as we approached, the lane's lights flickered and went out. We were left in almost complete darkness, with only the dim glow from our phones to light the way. The air grew colder, and an unsettling silence replaced the usual sounds of the alley. We moved carefully toward the malfunctioning lane, our footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, revealing that the balls had stopped rolling. Everything was still. We were about to head back to our lane when we heard a loud bang from the storage area behind the lanes. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped. We froze, adrenaline surging through us. No one had been back there since we arrived. We cautiously approached the storage area, our phones casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar, and we pushed it open. Inside, we found nothing out of the ordinary old bowling equipment, spare pins, and a dusty ball rack. But then, we noticed something strange. A small, vintage radio sitting on a shelf had been turned on, playing a low, crackling broadcast. The radio was old-fashioned, with dials and buttons that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The noise from the radio matched the eerie sound we'd heard earlier. The static grew louder as we approached, then suddenly cut off, and the radio went silent. The lights in the bowling alley flickered again and returned to normal. We stood there, bewildered, trying to make sense of it. We checked the radio, it was turned off, and when we tried to turn it on again, it did nothing. It was as if it had a mind of its own. We didn't touch anything else, deciding it was best to leave the mystery unsolved. We packed up and left shortly after, the eerie experience leaving a lingering chill. To this day, none of us can fully explain what happened. The bowling alley, with its vintage charm and creaky old equipment, had given us a night to remember. We often joke about the haunted lane, but deep down, we all know there was something unsettling about that night, something that remains unexplained. It was a spine-chilling encounter that left us all with more questions than answers, and a reminder that sometimes, the scariest experiences are the ones we can't quite explain. Last summer, I went bowling with my friends at the local alley, a quirky place with old-school charm. We were excited for a fun night of strikes and spares, but what happened was far from ordinary. We arrived around 9 p.m. The alley was mostly empty, save for a few scattered bowlers and the distant clatter of pins. We settled into a lane and started our game. The place had a nostalgic vibe with its neon lights and vintage decor, which made it feel cozy, even if it was a bit rundown. About an hour in, things took a strange turn. The lights flickered occasionally, which we attributed to the aging electrical system. Then, the music cut out suddenly, plunging the alley into an eerie silence. The only sound was the occasional thud of a bowling ball and the rolling of pins. My friend just noticed something odd. "Look at that," she said, pointing to the lane next to ours. It was vacant, but a bowling ball seemed to be rolling on its own. We all looked over, and sure enough, a ball was moving down the lane without anyone touching it. We laughed nervously, thinking it must be a mechanical glitch or a prank by the staff. I went over to check it out, but when I reached the lane, the ball stopped dead in its tracks. I gave it a gentle push, and it rolled smoothly back to the ball returning to our lane. We tried to brush off the incident, but an unsettling feeling lingered. The temperature in the alley seemed to drop, and a chill ran down my spine. Then, the lights flickered more violently, and we heard a soft, whispering sound. It was so faint we almost missed it, like someone was mumbling just out of earshot. Jess, clearly spooked, suggested we take a break and get some snacks. We agreed and headed to the concession stand, hoping a change of scenery would help. As we waited in line, I glanced back toward our lane. I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving across the floor, but when I blinked, it was gone. Returning to our lane, the air felt heavier. We resumed our game, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. Then, a loud crash echoed through the alley. We jumped, and I turned to see that a stack of bowling pins had fallen over in an adjacent lane, even though no one was nearby. We approached the fallen pins, but no one was around to explain the disturbance. As we were picking them up, one of the staff members, an older man with a tired expression, walked over and asked if everything was okay. I told him about the strange occurrences, but he just nodded and said, "It's probably nothing. Just old equipment, and the acoustics in here." Despite his reassurances, the atmosphere remained off. We decided to cut our night short. As we gathered our things, Jess pointed out a figure standing near the entrance, a woman dressed in a vintage bowling uniform. She seemed out of place, like she had stepped out of a different era. Her eyes, though, were the most unsettling, empty and distant. When I turned to tell my friends, the woman had vanished. We asked the staff if they had seen her, but they said no one had been near the entrance in a while. We left the bowling alley feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. In the weeks that followed, we shared our experience with others, but no one had any explanation for the strange events we witnessed. The bowling alley eventually closed down, replaced by a new establishment. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. The strange noises, flickering lights, and the ghostly figure at the entrance left us shaken but unharmed. It's one of those experiences that stays with you, leaving you to wonder if some places carry secrets that are best left undiscovered. It was a chilly Friday night in early November when my friends and I decided to hit up the local bowling alley. The place had an old-school charm with neon lights and retro decor, and it was usually a fun way to unwind. That night, however, was different. We arrived around 10 p.m. The alley was nearly empty, save for a few scattered bowlers and the occasional clatter of pins. We grabbed the lane, laced up our rented shoes, and set up for a night of strikes and spares. Everything seemed normal at first. As the hours passed, we noticed the place growing eerily quiet. By midnight, the only sounds were the distant rolls of bowling balls and the occasional echo of a pin falling. We joked about the place being a ghost town, but none of us thought much of it. Then, something strange happened. The lights in the bowling area flickered, and for a brief moment, the lane next to us went dark. We laughed it off, attributing it to some electrical glitch, but the weirdness didn't stop there. A few minutes later, we heard a peculiar noise, a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from the lane next to us. It sounded like someone was bowling, but when we glanced over, the lane was empty. No one was there, yet the sound continued. We exchanged uneasy glances but decided to ignore it. When the thumping grew louder and started moving closer, curiosity got the better of us. We approached the lane and found nothing unusual. The ball return system was silent, and the lane was still. As we were about to head back to our lane, the air around us grew colder. It wasn't just a chill. It felt like a presence. I turned to my friends and suggested we go outside for some fresh air, hoping to shake off the odd feeling. As we walked toward the exit, we noticed a strange figure standing by the entrance, a woman in an old-fashioned bowling uniform, with a vintage cap and an eerie, vacant stare. She wasn't moving, just standing there as if waiting for something. Her appearance seemed out of place, and the old-fashioned uniform made her look like she'd stepped out of a time warp. We stopped in our tracks, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the woman vanished, as if she'd never been there. We looked around, but there was no trace of her. We checked with the staff at the counter, but they hadn't seen anyone fitting her description. Feeling unnerved, we decided to call it a night. As we gathered our things, the lights flickered again, and the entire bowling alley seemed to hold its breath. We hurried out, our footsteps echoing in the deserted space. Once outside, we took a moment to calm our nerves. The night air felt oddly warm compared to the chill inside. We laughed off the experience, calling it a collective prank or a trick of the mind. But as we drove away, the strange sense of being watched lingered. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it. The bowling alley has since closed down and turned into a different business. But I can't shake the feeling that something was there with us, a remnant of another time or something else entirely. To this day, I can't explain what we saw, but I know that night was different. It was a chilling experience that left us all with more questions than answers. Sometimes, the most unsettling experiences are the ones that defy explanation and leave you wondering about what might still be lurking in the shadows. It was a chill November evening, and my friends and I had decided to hit the local bowling alley for a casual night out. The place was a retro gem, with its faded carpet, dim lighting, and the distinctive smell of old shoes and popcorn. We had been there many times before, but this night would be different, an encounter that still sends shivers down my spine. We arrived around 8 p.m. The alley was quiet, save for the occasional clatter of pins and the low hum of the jukebox in the corner. We chose a lane and settled in, joking and laughing as we started our game. The atmosphere was relaxed until the lights above us began to flicker intermittently. We didn't think much of it at first, attributing it to the place's age. About an hour into our game, the lights flickered more intensely and then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness. I remember the collective murmur of surprise and nervous laughter. The emergency lights, casting an eerie green glow, kicked in shortly after. The alley now looked like a scene from an old horror movie, with its shadows stretching long and distorted. We were just starting to make jokes about the situation when the silence was broken by a loud and natural scraping sound coming from the lane next to ours. It was as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. My friend Dave, always up for a scare, walked over to investigate. Probably just some old equipment, he said, though he didn't sound too convinced. As he approached the lane, the scraping sound suddenly stopped. Dave looked around but saw nothing unusual, just the same old equipment and pins. The eerie feeling in the room intensified as we resumed our game. Then, without warning, the ball return system in the lane next to us started to whir loudly. Though no one had touched it, we exchanged uneasy glances. The bowling alley's staff, typically friendly and approachable, seemed to be avoiding eye contact with us, which added to our discomfort. Trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, we continued to bowl. Then, the air grew colder, and a strange mist seemed to roll in from nowhere, swirling around our lane. The mist was thin, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to thicken around the edges of the lane. My friend Jessica, who was always the most sensitive to odd occurrences, looked visibly shaken. "Something's not right here," she whispered. I nodded in agreement, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. In the midst of our anxiety, we heard a soft, mournful sound of barely audible melody, like an old song on a broken record. It was coming from the direction of the jukebox. I went over to investigate, but the jukebox was silent, its display screen dark and inactive. By now, we were all on edge. We decided it was best to cut our night short. As we gathered our things, I noticed that the bowling pins on the adjacent lane had been set up in a perfect triangle, something they hadn't been in before. It was as if someone or something had rearranged them deliberately. We hurried to the front desk to return our rental shoes and settle up. The staff, visibly more attentive now, asked if everything was all right. I hesitated, unsure if I should share our experiences. But seeing the concern on their faces, I told them about the lights, the scraping sound, the mist, and the rearranged pins. They exchanged uneasy looks and assured us that they'd look into it. As we left the alley, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The normal hum of the city seemed eerily quiet, and the dark streets seemed to close in on us. We all agreed that we'd never be returning to that bowling alley, but the memory of that night lingered with us. We never found out what caused those strange occurrences, whether it was a series of coincidences or something more unsettling. But whatever it was, it left a lasting impression. To this day, the bowling alley remains a chilling chapter in our book of experiences, a reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. It was a crisp winter night when my friends and I decided to hit up the old bowling alley downtown. The place had been around forever and had a quirky charm with its retro decor and the scent of old wood and synthetic oil. We were looking forward to a fun night, but what happened turned out to be anything but ordinary. We arrived around 9 p.m., and the alley was eerily quiet. The usual clatter of bowling balls and the occasional cheer from other bowlers were missing. The dim lighting and the hum of the overhead fans gave the place a faintly unsettling atmosphere. We shrugged it off and chose a lane near the back, hoping for some privacy. As we set up, the power flickered once or twice but came back on without much fuss. The staff, usually friendly and chatty, seemed a bit off. They were polite but avoided eye contact and seemed eager to get back to whatever they were doing behind the counter. Our game started off normally, but the mood shifted when the lights began to flicker more erratically. I joked about the place being haunted, and we all laughed it off. Then, the lane next to us suddenly lit up with a harsh, bright light. We all turned to see what was going on, but the lane was empty, and the light quickly faded. The real trouble started when we noticed that our bowling balls seemed to be moving on their own. It was subtle at first, one ball shifting a few inches on the return rack. At first, we thought it was just gravity or a trick of the mind, but then it happened again, and this time, it was more pronounced. A ball rolled slowly to the edge of the rack and then stopped. We were getting uneasy but tried to brush it off as a series of coincidences. That was until the strange noises began. It started with a faint whispering sound, like someone talking just out of earshot. We couldn't make out any words, just an eerie murmur that grew louder as time went on. Dave, always the skeptic, decided to investigate. He walked over to the adjacent lane, which was still empty, and peered into the dark corners. As he turned to come back, the lights flickered violently, plunging the entire alley into near darkness. We scrambled to turn on our phones for light, trying to keep our composure. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, and it felt like the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. We could see our breath forming visible puffs in the cold air. Just as we were about to call it a night, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the alley. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped or thrown. Jessica, who had been especially anxious, gasped and pointed to the scoreboard. It showed an unfamiliar message: "Get out." The display was flashing it repeatedly in bright red letters. We all stared, wide-eyed and speechless. Despite the growing dread, none of us wanted to be the first to leave, but the atmosphere was becoming unbearable. We grabbed our belongings quickly, and as we made our way to the exit, the power cut out entirely. We were plunged into darkness again, but the emergency lights kicked in almost immediately. We stumbled out of the alley, hearts racing. The cold night air felt like a relief compared to the oppressive atmosphere inside. We looked back at the bowling alley and saw the staff standing outside, looking as bewildered as we felt. We never returned to that bowling alley, and although we never learned what exactly happened that night, the experience left a mark on us. We all agreed that some places hold secrets better left undiscovered. The bowling alley remained a chilling memory, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are those we can't fully understand or explain. I'm not sure how to begin this story, but I swear it's all true. Last winter, my friends and I decided to hit up an old bowling alley that had been in town for decades. We were looking forward to a night of strikes and spares, but what happened that night was anything but ordinary. The bowling alley was pretty much deserted when we arrived, save for a few people scattered about. It had that classic 80s vibe, with neon lights and shiny lanes that seemed to have seen better days. We settled into a lane towards the back, laughing and joking as we began our game. It was around midnight when things took a turn. The lights started to flicker intermittently, which we thought was just a power issue. We shrugged it off and continued to bowl, but then the whispers began. They were faint at first, like distant conversations that you can't quite make out. We tried to ignore it, attributing it to the acoustics of the place or maybe just our imagination. Then, the bowling balls started moving. We had left them in the return rack, but one by one, they began to roll on their own. We watched in disbelief as one ball rolled slowly off the rack and stopped at the edge of the lane. It was impossible. The ball was perfectly balanced, so there was no reason it should have moved. Dave, the bravest among us, went to check it out. As he approached the ball, the lights above us flickered wildly. He reached out to grab the ball, and just then, a loud and natural sound filled the air like a rusty metal screeching. We all froze, our eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, now sounding like multiple voices speaking in hushed tones. It was clear that they were coming from all around us, though no one was near. The temperature in the alley dropped significantly, and our breaths began to mist up in the suddenly frigid air. We decided it was time to leave, but as we turned to gather our things, the scoreboard went haywire. It flashed the word "run" in bright, red letters. Panic set in as we scrambled to collect our belongings. The bowling alley was eerily silent except for the growing cacophony of whispers. As we made our way to the exit, the power cut out completely. We were plunged into near darkness, the emergency lights flickering on just enough to guide us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as we hurried out of the building. Once outside, we took a moment to catch our breath and looked back at the bowling alley. The lights were out, and the place looked abandoned. The staff, who had seemed perfectly normal earlier, were now standing outside, looking as bewildered as we felt. They said nothing, just watched us leave. We never went back to that alley. The experience left us all shaken, and while nothing physical happened to us, the atmosphere was so intense that it felt like we barely escaped something truly sinister. We couldn't explain it, and we didn't want to try. It's been months since that night, but the memory still sends shivers down my spine. Some places hold dark secrets that are better left undisturbed, and the bowling alley in our town is one of those places. I have always loved bowling, and last summer, my friends and I decided to spend a Saturday night at a local alley that had just reopened after a renovation. It was a nostalgic spot from our childhood, and we were eager to relive some old memories. What we didn't expect was to stumble into something so chilling. The bowling alley, with its fresh coat of paint and newly polished lanes, seemed perfectly normal when we walked in. The atmosphere was lighthearted, filled with the clatter of pins and the occasional cheer. We picked a lane towards the back, lane 7. Little did we know, this lane would become the epicenter of our terrifying experience. Around midnight, as we were in the middle of our game, the lights above lane 7 flickered. At first, We thought it was just a minor electrical glitch. But then, the flickering grew more intense, and an unsettling chill filled the air. We shrugged it off, attributing it to the air conditioning or perhaps just a draft. Suddenly, one of the bowling balls on the rack started moving. It rolled slowly from its place, stopping right at the edge of our lane. We laughed it off, thinking it was just a prank from one of the other players. My friend Dave, eager to investigate, went to pick up the ball. As he did, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the lights above us flickered violently. As Dave reached for the ball, I noticed something strange. The screen above our lane, which displayed our scores, began to glitch. It flashed random numbers and symbols before showing the word help in red letters. My heart pounded. It wasn't part of the game. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances. Then, the whispers started. At first, they were so faint that we thought they were coming from another group. But as they grew louder, it became clear that they were coming from all around us, echoing off the walls. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of hushed, urgent whispers. The bowling alley, once lively and warm, now felt oppressive and cold. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we turned to gather our things, the bowling ball return system made a loud, mechanical clanking sound. One by one, the balls began to roll back into the racks with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. We rushed to our things, our nerves frayed. As we approached the exit, the emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers continued, now louder and more insistent. The exit door felt like it took forever to open, as if something unseen was trying to keep us inside. Finally, we burst out into the parking lot, gasping for fresh air. We looked back at the bowling alley, which was now dark and silent, except for the emergency lights. The once cheerful neon signs now seemed menacing in the gloom. The next day, we learned from a local that the alley had a history of strange occurrences, but nothing so intense as what we experienced. The staff had reported out happenings, but nothing had ever been as alarming as what we witnessed. We never returned to that lane, and the experience left a lasting mark on all of us. To this day, whenever I pass by that alley, a shiver runs down my spine. I can't explain what happened that night, but the memory of those flickering lights, the whispers, and the eerie messages still haunt me. Sometimes, I wonder if we narrowly escaped something far more sinister than a simple prank, and that's why, every time someone asks about the bowling alley, I just smile and say, it's a nice place, but stick to lanes 1 through 6. I'll never forget that night at the bowling alley. It was a quiet Wednesday when my friends and I decided to visit a local bowling center that had recently reopened. We were all excited, having fond memories of our past bowling nights. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing evening, but what happened turned out to be anything but. When we arrived, the alley was sparsely populated, which was unusual for a weeknight. The lanes were mostly empty except for a few scattered players. We chose lane 13, positioned near the back of the building. The atmosphere was a mix of old and new, with the vintage neon signs glowing against the fresh coat of paint. As we started our game, everything seemed normal. The occasional crash of pins and the sound of our laughter filled the air, but then, something peculiar happened. Every time one of us rolled a strike, the lights above our lane flickered briefly. At first, we thought it was just a coincidence or an electrical issue. About an hour in, a group of strangers arrived and took the lane right next to ours. They were a little odd, dressed in dark, outdated clothing and speaking in hushed tones. They had an eerie aura about them, but nothing overtly alarming. We tried to ignore them and focus on our game. As the night progressed, the temperature around lane 13 dropped noticeably. It wasn't cold enough to be uncomfortable, but it was a definite chill that seemed to follow us wherever we moved. We joked about the air conditioning being too high, but it felt different, almost unnatural. Then the noises started. We heard soft, rhythmic tapping from the neighboring lane. It sounded like someone was knocking on the divider between the lanes. We glanced over and saw the strangers intensely focused on their game, not making a sound. One of my friends, Sarah, jokingly said, "Maybe they're trying to get our attention." We laughed it off, but the tapping continued, growing more insistent. It became clear that the sound wasn't coming from the strangers, it was coming from behind the wall. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I walked over to the wall separating lane 13 from the one next door. As I leaned in to listen, the tapping stopped abruptly. It was as if someone had turned off a switch. When I turned around, the strangers were watching me. Their gaze was unsettling, almost as if they knew something we didn't. I shrugged it off and returned to my friends, who were now visibly uneasy. We decided to cut our night short. Despite our initial plans to stay longer. As we gathered our things, I glanced over at the strangers once more. They were now standing silently at their lane, their bowling balls perfectly aligned on the rack. It was strange to see them just standing there, not interacting with each other or moving at all. We hurried out of the bowling alley, the sense of unease lingering. The moment we stepped outside, the temperature seemed to normalize. We looked back at the building, which now seemed much darker and more foreboding than before. The next day, I did a bit of research and found out that Lane 13 had a history. The alley had been around for decades, and there were some old rumors about strange occurrences there. One story mentioned that Lane 13 had been the site of several unexplained incidents, but nothing concrete was ever proven. The stories had been dismissed by most as urban legends or mere coincidence. That night was the last time we ever visited that alley. To this day, whenever someone brings up the topic of bowling or Lane 13, a shiver runs down my spine. The memory of those strangers and the eerie tapping remains with me. It's a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things aren't always visible. They're the feelings of unease that linger long after you leave. I'll never forget that night at the old bowling alley. It was supposed to be a fun evening with friends, but it turned into something I still can't explain. My friends and I were avid bowlers, always seeking out new alleys to try, and when we stumbled upon this one, it seemed like the perfect spot for a casual game. The alley was old, with a musty smell and flickering neon lights that gave it an eerie ambience. The moment we walked in, the place felt off, but we brushed it off as just our imagination. We chose Lane 13, which was tucked away in a dimly lit corner. It was an odd choice, but the lane was available, and we didn't think much of it at the time. The first few games went smoothly. We joked and laughed as we bowled, the clatter of pins mingling with our chatter. But as the night wore on, things began to feel strange. The temperature in the bowling area dropped noticeably. It wasn't cold, but there was a distinct chill in the air that seemed to settle around Lane 13. I shrugged it off as a draft from an old building. My friend Laura, who was always more sensitive to changes in atmosphere, mentioned feeling uneasy. She joked about ghosts and haunted lanes, but none of us took her seriously. It wasn't until we heard the tapping that things took a turn. At first, it was faint, just a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the other side of the wall. We all looked around, trying to locate the source. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone was knocking on the lane divider. Probably just the pipes, I said, trying to reassure everyone. But the tapping continued, growing in intensity. We glanced over at the adjacent lane, where a group of strangers were bowling in silence. They didn't seem to notice the noise, and their behavior was oddly calm, which made the situation even stranger. Laura decided to investigate. She walked over to the wall separating our lane from the next, pressing her against it. The tapping stopped abruptly, as if someone had suddenly become aware of our presence. Laura returned, looking unsettled but trying to laugh it off. "I don't know what that was," she said, "but it's probably nothing." We tried to continue our game, but the atmosphere had changed. The lane felt oppressive, the air thick with an inexplicable heaviness. We joked nervously to keep our spirits up, but the fun had drained from the evening. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something odd. The strangers next door were still there, standing silently at their lane with their bowling balls neatly arranged on the rack. They hadn't moved or spoken the entire time. Their stillness was unnerving, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. The moment we stepped outside, the temperature seemed to return to normal. We laughed about the strange night, but the experience left us all feeling unsettled. We decided not to return to that alley, and when we heard rumors that the place was rumored to be haunted, it only confirmed our suspicions. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of that night. The tapping and the cold, the unnerving presence of the strangers, it all combined to create an experience that defied logic and explanation. While nothing harmful happened to us, the memory of Lane 13 remains a chilling reminder that sometimes, the scariest things are the ones that can't be easily explained away. I'll never forget the night we spent at the old bowling alley on Elm Street. It was a quiet, unremarkable place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. The flickering neon sign outside gave it an almost charming, if slightly eerie, vibe. My friends and I were looking for a casual night out, and this old spot seemed perfect. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The interior was as you'd expect: worn carpets, dim lighting, and a smell of old leather and grease. We picked lane 7, not for any particular reason other than it being the closest available. The night started off normally. We were having a great time, joking and throwing strikes and spares. However, about an hour into our game, things began to take a turn. The lights flickered occasionally, but that was hardly unusual for such an old place. What started to unsettle us was a strange, low humming noise. It was barely audible over the sound of bowling balls and clattering pins, but it was persistent. At first, we thought it was just the sound system acting up, but it didn't quite fit. It was more like a deep, resonant hum, coming from somewhere near lane 7. We checked the speakers and found nothing wrong. The hum continued, and I began to notice an odd chill in the air around our lane. The real creepiness set in when we noticed a shadow. As I was lining up a shot, I saw a dark shape moving across the wall behind us. It wasn't the shadow of a person, it was more like a distorted, amorphous shape that seemed to writhe and shift. I pointed it out to my friends, but by the time they looked, the shadow was gone. We tried to rationalize it, but the unease was growing. Then came the footsteps. We were the only group bowling that night, or so we thought. The sound of footsteps echoed from the end of our lane, like someone was pacing back and forth. We looked down the lane, but no one was there. The footsteps grew louder and more erratic, as though someone was walking back and forth in a hurry. Lavra, one of my friends, suggested we take a break and get some snacks from the vending machines. As we walked away from the lane, the humming grew louder and more intense. It felt as if something was following us. We stopped to buy snacks, but the eerie feeling didn't go away. When we returned to lane 7, the humming had stopped, and everything seemed to be normal again. We joked about the experience to lighten the mood, but the sense of dread lingered. By the end of the night, we packed up our things and decided it was time to leave. As we walked towards the exit, I glanced back at lane 7 one last time. For a brief moment, I saw the shadow again, this time more defined and moving purposefully along the lane. The strange occurrences at lane 7 left us all feeling uneasy. We tried to rationalize it, but the combination of the humming, the shadow, and the footsteps made it impossible to forget. It was an experience that left an indelible mark on us, a reminder that sometimes, the spookiest places are the ones we least expect. The next time someone mentions that old bowling alley, I can't help but shiver. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I do know one thing: I'll never forget the eerie, inexplicable events that unfolded at lane 7. I've always been a fan of spooky stories, but I never expected to experience something truly terrifying myself. It was just a regular Friday night when my friends and I decided to hit up the old bowling alley on the edge of town. The place had seen better days but had a charm to it that we found endearing. The alley was almost empty when we arrived. A few scattered bowlers, a tired-looking clerk, and the usual smell of old shoes and greasy pizza. We chose lane 4, and as we settled in, I noticed something strange. The lights above our lane flickered intermittently. I mentioned it to my friends, but they brushed it off, attributing it to the old wiring. Our game began as usual. Strikes, pairs, and friendly banter. But then, about an hour into our game, the lights above our lane went out completely. We were plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by the dim glow of the nearby arcade games and a few emergency exit signs. We laughed it off, assuming it was a power issue. When the lights flickered back on, I noticed something odd. A cold draft seemed to be blowing from the end of our lane. It was an unusual sensation, considering the air conditioning was off. I shrugged it off, but my friend Laura seemed unsettled. She mentioned that she felt a presence, as though someone was watching us. The real fright began when we heard the sounds. At first, it was just a low, rhythmic thudding, like the sound of a heavy object being dragged. We all tried to ignore it, attributing it to the alley's old equipment. But then, the thudding grew louder and more erratic. It felt like it was coming from directly behind us, at the end of our lane. I decided to investigate. I walked to the end of the lane, where I found nothing out of the ordinary. The floor was clean, the pins were in place, and there was no sign of any unusual disturbances. I returned to my friends, who were now visibly anxious. As I sat down, the lights above our lane flickered again, and then, for a split second, went out completely. When they came back on, the temperature around us seemed to drop. Our breath became visible, and we huddled closer together, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The final straw came when one of the bowling balls rolled down the lane on its own. We had all set our balls down and were nowhere near the lane, but one of the balls started moving, as if guided by an invisible hand. It rolled slowly, stopping just before the pins. We stared at each other in disbelief. My friend Mark tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked with nervousness. The air felt heavier, and the sense of being watched was almost palpable. We decided it was time to leave. As we packed up our things, the lights flickered one last time, and the cold draft returned, stronger than before. We hurried to the exit, our hearts racing. Once outside, we looked back at the old bowling alley. It seemed normal from the outside, but we all knew that something strange had happened inside. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced that night. The old bowling alley has since closed down, and the building is now abandoned. Some say it's haunted, others dismiss it as old equipment acting up. But for me and my friends, it's a night we'll never forget, a true encounter with something unsettling and inexplicable. The bowling alley may have been just a place to have fun, but that night, it became something far more sinister. We survived, but we left with an eerie story that still gives me chills whenever I think about it.